Hello and welcome to our last video in our chapter 42 lecture. In this section, we will talk about disruptions in the immune system. And our learning objectives are to describe hypersensitivity and define autoimmunity. But first, we're going to start with immunodeficiency. This is when we have a failure or insufficiency or delay in the response of our immune system. And this could be acquired or inherited. It could be acquired through radiation exposure that could destroy our populations of lymphocytes and elevate someone's susceptibility to infections and cancer. This is certainly seen in somebody with HIV. You could see some of the conditions in which they can develop here. And then we have chemical exposure, which for example would be like the radiation we talked about, and then malnutrition or possibly extreme stress could also have it develop. Some examples of immunodeficiencies would also include severe combined immunodeficiency, known as SID. So this is a very popular case over here. And in SIDS, we are going to have both antibody and cell-mediated immunity inadequate or lacking. So even just a minor infection can be fatal. So this individual was known as a bubble boy because he literally lived within a bubble and could not be anywhere within our actual world because of fear of a pathogen coming into contact with him. You can be treated with a bone marrow transplant or gene therapy in order to start building some type of immunity to pathogens. Another condition is known as Bare lymphocyte syndrome and MHC2 deficiencies. Now let's switch over to hypersensitivities. These are maladaptive immune responses toward harmless foreign substances. It could be being stung by a bee, to a perfume, to a nut allergy. Or it could even be to our self-antigens that occur after tissue sensitization. And we do have different types of hypersensitivities. Your book discusses immediate, delayed, and autoimmunity. So we'll start off talking about immediate hypersensitivities, and that would include allergies. So an allergy is when we have an immune reaction from an immediate hypersensitivity to which our antibody-mediated immune response is going to take place within minutes of exposure to that harmless antigen. So when we first get initially exposed to an antigen, let's say it's this ragweed pollen, we are going to have an allergic individual start synthesizing through the activation of B cells, differentiating into plasma cells, and secrete IgE. This class typically mediates the immune response to parasitic worms, but we also know that they play a role in allergic reactions. So that constant domain is going to interact with our mast cells, and that is embedded within our connective tissues that can then secrete chemicals that could cause symptoms. Symptoms such as sneezing, itchy, watery eyes, which can lead to more fatal symptoms that could lead to anaphylactic shock. That would include intense itchy welts or hives, airway contraction, so we're getting bronchoconstriction with respiratory distress taking place, and a plummeting of blood pressure. So you have to treat individuals that are having these symptoms with epinephrine ASAP so it reverses those actions. The next type we'll discuss is delayed hypersensitivity. This is more of a cell-mediated immune response, and it takes about 1 to 2 days after that secondary exposure for a maximal reaction to be observed. So we have this individual here that has or it looks like a rash developed or contact dermatitis on his wrist area. Perhaps they were wearing a bracelet in which the material irritated them, or a watch of some sort. So it's going to involve our helper T cells type 1 cytokine mediated inflammatory responses, and it's just manifesting within the local tissue lesions. Like we said, contact dermatitis can develop, which is more like a rash or some type of skin irritation. We can also have this take place if we come into contact with poison ivy. Then we have autoimmunity. This is a hypersensitivity to our self-antigens that starts to develop over time. It affects about 5% of our population, and the antibodies that develop are known as autoantibodies. Auto meaning self, meaning that they're looking at our own self-antigens as being foreign, so they start attacking them. So it'll primarily involve that hormonal immune response because of those antibodies, right? And it may be due to something known as molecular mimicry. And this is when our self-antigens structurally are mimicking our pathogen antigens, kind of like that cross-reactivity that we were talking about earlier. And some examples of autoimmune diseases would be myasthenia gravis, and this targets our muscle cell receptors that respond to acetylcholine. Notice in this image on the right-hand side here, we are showing the secretion of acetylcholine across this cleft so that it can reach our motor end plate. But because these antibodies are attaching here to the acetylcholine receptors, acetylcholine is not able to bind to be able to cause the muscle to contract. And so the symptoms that we get are muscle weakness and difficulty with our fine, gross motor functions. Another autoimmune disease is known as lupus, or its full name is systemic lupus erythematosus. And this is when we have autoantibodies that respond to DNA and proteins. So you can imagine the slew of symptoms that we can have because we have these substances all throughout our body, and it is going to affect, for example, our heart, our joints, lungs, skin, kidneys, and our central nervous system. It essentially causes tissue damage by antibody binding, our complement proteins are recruited, and inflammation takes place. So just some typical symptoms of lupus would be getting a facial rash. This is kind of known as the butterfly rash that appears, having mouth and nose ulcers, muscle aches, pericarditis, which is inflammation of the pericardium, that sac that surrounds the heart, and poor circulation in the fingers and toes. The last autoimmune disease we will discuss is type 1 diabetes mellitus. The cause of this is that we have our Th1 cells respond against our insulin-producing pancreatic cells, so we are no longer able to secrete insulin. And so our patients are going to require insulin injections from external sources so that we can allow glucose to be removed from our blood and moved into our cells to lower our blood glucose.